us. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Papadakos, who is a fellow Greek, but from Sparta. I'm from Athens. Who is visiting Detroit, and I thought it would be nice to have him giving us a good lecture. He's in Rochester, New York, and he's a tenure professor of, as you can see, anesthesiology, surgery, neurology, neurosurgery, what else? He has close to 90 papers, 50 chapters, and 7 books, including an encyclopedia of critical care, as far as I remember, which is 900 pages.
Yep.
And also a book about mechanical ventilation. And he's going to talk to you about pathophysiology of mechanical ventilation today. So,
thank you so much, Panos. Actually, this is my first time visiting the Henry Ford Hospital, and I appreciate the lovely hospitality and touring around lovely facility. I've known Dr. Rivers for, unfortunately, a quarter of a century. I'm old. And, you know, we talk about age, and how many people here are fellows and residents? Right? People have sentinel moments in their medical careers. And the sentinel moment for me was I was at a conference, at an SCCM meeting. I was a fellow, and I heard a great lecture on mechanical ventilation and surfactant dysfunction from that gentleman. And that's a slightly younger version of me, and that's taken in our laboratories in Rotterdam, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We're now in Berlin, but I walked up to Professor Lachman, the guy who's one of the discoverers of surfactant. We talked, he goes, you have to work with me. And that started a 20-plus year collaboration in research, including NIH funding, European Union funding, a lot of funding. And the pinnacle of that was in 2008, if you ever want to read a boring book, Mechanical Ventilation, Clinical Applications in Pathophysiology, with people from around the country and the world. And it's kind of been an adventure. And thank you again for our invitation. This is obviously, you guys know what this is. This is the University of Rochester Medical Center, located, just like you guys, Henry Ford was the major mover for your hospital. George Eastman, a contemporary and friend of Henry Ford's, was the major donor that gave us the University of Rochester Medical Center. So mechanical ventilation, which is the premier thing that we do as intensivists and doctors, it's the #1 modality of support that we use in the intensive care unit. And in most places, if you're not on the ventilator, you're being transferred to the step-down unit. I know about bed problems. You probably have the same thing, a lot of pressure. We're a level 1 trauma center. We're a quaternary hospital. We do every transplant on the face of the earth. So there's a lot of pressure on my faculty to transfer patients out of the ICU. And the one thing that keeps you in the ICU is mechanical ventilation. But mechanical ventilation that we've used since the turn of the century, the previous century, we didn't quite have a good handle on it till about 10 years ago. So we didn't understand that mechanical ventilation in itself can cause problems. So you could get inactivation of pulmonary surfactant, increased alveolar capillary permeability, but more importantly, you can activate the systemic inflammatory response. So bad mechanical ventilation or non-physiologically based mechanical ventilation can cause a problem, can actually add to the systemic inflammatory response. And we're going to go over some of the physiology of that and facts on mortality and morbidity. And, you know, you look at studies, mechanical ventilation, overall mortality in ICUs. This is from Dr. Esteban's paper that was in JAMA, a snapshot of a day in all the ICUs all over the world. If overall mortality 30%, this is 28-day mortality, 31%, and if you had ARDS, it was 52% mortality. 90-day mortality, non-ARDS, ARDS. Again, this is from another one of these snapshot studies, 2000, in intensive care medicine, which is the major European journal of critical care medicine. And it was 44.2% to 41.3%. These are very interesting numbers because then you have centers of excellence around the world that have mortalities for ARDS, mechanical ventilation, that are in single numbers or low 20s, 17%, 12%, 18%. And the common thread through all these ICUs that do a good job is that people understand the physiology of the process, the therapy. What is the therapy doing? What is the physiology? So basic science still has a very important role in caring for patients. All right. That's me. That's this young man in native Greek dress. I put that picture in there for Panos. You have a tree skew, a whale, a lion, and an elephant. What do all those things have in common? Huh? They all do what? They all breathe. They all breathe, but more importantly, they're warm-blooded what? Mammals. All right. So if you went back to when I trained in critical care medicine, which was the 1970s, you used to walk into the ICU, everybody was on 10 cc's per kg, or some kind of number like that. 20 at peak, super peak, this was the era of that. But what we didn't understand, which is how important physiology is, all mammals have a tidal volume of 6.3 cc's per kg. And we've known this since 1923. And Dr. Villar and Dr. Kasmarek kind of republished the data, but the initial data and the German physiologists had figured out that the 6.3 mLs per kg was for thermal regulation for warm-blooded creatures. Okay? Why is that an important number? Hopefully your ICU is doing 5 to 7 cc's per kg, right? And you all quote ARDSNet. We did not participate in ARDSNet because I was trained by Dr. Lachman. We always used 6 cc's per kg because it was a physiological number. ARDSNet spent $2.7 billion to prove that humans are mammals. Okay? Very important point. Why were we using super levels of mechanical ventilation? Well, in 1949, Huger in Germany developed one of the first anesthesia machines that had an automated bellows. And in the initial paper in Lancet in 1949, it gave you the reason why we did 10 cc's per kg. It said in the discussion it was a nice round number, easy to remember. Which was totally, if you remember from your pulmonary function tests, the 70 kilo person was not breathing 700 cc's out, so you were going contradictory in medical school into that number. So that's just one of the things that we've done. I'm also an amateur photographer since we live in Rochester, where film kind of got its start. We have the third largest waterfall in the Northeast after Niagara Falls in the center of town, which is surrounded by urban blight. Okay? Now we get into the lung. We talked about 6.3 cc's per kg. We're mammals, thermal regulation. It's part of the wiring. But how many of you know that the lung has a skeleton? And that is the lung skeleton. All your alveoli, all your blood vessels, your bronchi, your terminal bronchi are all held up against gravity in this skeleton. And it's a force-bearing structure because we stand, or everything would get atelectatic, right, from the weight of the lung above it. It has elastin and collagen that are embedded in an extracellular matrix, 2 fibers system connected at alveolar levels, one originating from the hilum and the other from the visceral pleura into the periphery. This is a very important skeleton because cigarette smoke and pollutants can affect the skeleton. And what do you get if the skeleton starts falling apart and alveoli start falling apart? Bullae, right? How many of you, I do a lot of trauma. I attend in the I'm the director of critical care medicine, so I get to pick which one of my ICUs. So I do trauma, and I do the neuro ICU because I find those very stimulating. I get to deal with gunshot wounds and all of that stuff. And then I got the more quiet patient population, strokes and subarachnoid hemorrhages, and status epilepticus. But that becomes very important because in the trauma ICU, sometimes we have people with massive pulmonary contusions that we take care of, and they come to us from outlying medical centers. You're unweanable, and you get a CT scan or an X-ray of this young person, 23, 24-year-old person's chest, because he was using plastic milk boxes to hold up his car while he was working underneath it. And the car collapses on him. And then he gets 10 cc's per kg, large amounts of PEEP, and the skeleton tears apart. You get large bullae. So then we've identified a condition that we call post-traumatic pulmonary emphysema that we see in these patients. And again, here's just yet another illustration. When you own a scanning electron microscope, I apologize, you have to actually show off what you did with the government money. So here's a scanning electron microscope picture, and you can see some of the bullae down here in a mouse model that you see how these things end. And if you really want to look at it, this is when you go up on, this animal was getting 20 cc's per kg. And look what happened. You get fractures of the skeleton. And that's going to tear apart. So barotrauma that we've been talking about for a lot of years can cause a breakdown in the skeleton and the entire, and I have the trauma ICU, so we have ortho residents. And you make this slide, they go, how come you can't put a plate across this fracture? All right, so there is a fracture. I need to fix it. Okay, now we have the skeleton, we got the muscle now, the diaphragm, right? You learned in 4th grade science that breathing muscle, it goes up and down, right? 4th grade or 5th grade, whenever you learned about that. But the diaphragm is a very important organ that we affect with mechanical ventilation. It obviously generates, when the diaphragm goes down, it generates a negative pressure of -4. So we kind of breathe in pressure control. So it generates a negative flow, but it's made out of a muscle. So it has stellate cell activation in diaphragmatic fibers. It's made of, going back to medical school, it is made up of various fiber types, type 1, type 2A, type 3, and what have you. And if you look at this slide, when you place somebody on mechanical ventilation, this is mechanical ventilation, spontaneous breathing and controlled breathing, you'll notice there's differences in the fiber makeup. The fiber makeup changes when you place people on mechanical ventilation. How many of you have that patient in the ICU that's been in the ICU 120 days and is trying to be weaned off the ventilator? And is failing miserably, right? They have to be sent to a long-term facility. Everybody can understand that as a muscle, it's going to change in fiber percentages. And not only that, it's going to get weak because it is a skeletal muscle. The diaphragm is a very important skeletal muscle. It keeps you alive. And when we look at this slide from Powers, you see here controlled ventilation. But then, can you see that there's changes in the force generated by this muscle even with 12, 18 hours, and 24 hours of mechanical ventilation? So if you overwhelm the diaphragm and put them on total mechanical ventilation and you do not allow spontaneous breathing, you can actually change the etiology and the makeup of the skeletal muscle. And right here is a control. And I think photographs, you guys live on your iPhones and Facebook, so you're visually kindred to seeing photographs of things. And this is the case, right? Can everybody see that there's a difference in the microstructure, the makeup of the slow myosin and fast myosin heavy chain nerve fibers? Can everybody see that? You know how long this took? 24 hours. This is control. This is a young medical student volunteer who was having a laparoscopic gallbladder taken out, and they signed the consent to have this is the control, right? So signed consent that they wanted just, a nice muscle fiber. And the case is a 24-year-old traumatic brain injury secondary to a .45 caliber bullet who was awaiting organ harvesting. And this case is 24 hours later. So even 24 hours later, in a healthy person that's brain dead, that didn't have muscle, lung pathophysiology, you can actually see a change in the muscle structure of the diaphragm. In this pediatric case, we have somebody being followed with biopsies at 3 days and at 47 days. This is a young pediatric intensive care patient. And you can clearly see how we affect the diaphragm in terms of using mechanical ventilation. That's why in 2016, the majority of ventilators used in ICU give you the option of assisting spontaneous breathing, right? So APRV, pressure regulated volume control, MMV, so the majority of modalities that are being developed in mechanical ventilators in this time period are such that they're modes that will allow. All right, how many of you deal with atelectasis in the ICU? It is your enemy. Okay? Nice pictures from my book. You can get it free copy on the internet. And how many of you have seen this CT scan? This is one of our patients, struck by a car, bicyclist, terrible CT scan. But in critical illness, in an ICU, there's a fact that each lung has a tendency of collapse to generate atelectasis. And we've known this since 1960. Dr. Benimoff was kind of an interesting guy. He was an anesthesiologist. He was chair of anesthesia at Columbia University in 1960. He was also president of the medical center. He was dean of the medical school. And he brilliantly married one of the Rockefeller girls. So he was one of the, he was I guess his name tag said Dr. Beneboff Boss. Okay. So he's the guy that, when you were in medical school learning about FRC, he kind of coined the word. And he did a lot of the work of looking at what happens. And just think of this. This is from the operating room. This is induction of anesthesia with spontaneous breathing, paralysis using curare. This is 1960, so they were on cyclopropane, probably spontaneous breathing until they got the curare. Then the bellows would go up. But what happens when we lay people down? As you remember from physiology class, closing capacity, closing volume is very close. You get decreases in FRC when you're lying down because your diaphragm moves up. So how do we keep most patients in the ICU? Flat. In a lot of European ICUs, they have people sitting up. So something as stupid and simple as having your patient sitting up in the intensive care unit can help prevent atelectasis. Because atelectasis causes VQ mismatching, decrease in oxygenation, and you've all remembered alveolar dead space where there's no blood flow and the alveoli is open, and then you have other areas where there is no alveoli and you just have shunt, and you remember the shunt equation in medical school for exams and then forgot it the day later. Now at least you can look it up on your phone. Okay? So lung mechanics change with lung collapse. Because remember, we want to give 6.3 cc's per kg. Right? But if I give 6.3 cc's per kg and 80% of my lung is atelectatic, each alveoli is going to see a lot more than 6.3 cc's per kg, and it's going to get very unhappy. So one of the things you have to worry about is volume trauma from high lung volumes, atelectatic trauma, trauma from low lung volumes, and in shear forces, the worst area in your lung are going to be areas of cyclic opening and closing. So when you manage mechanical ventilation, it is always incumbent on you that you maintain the alveoli open and splinted, just like you do right now. Do you know you guys peep yourselves? You're sitting here getting peeped. Every so often you take something called a sigh breath, right? And if the lecture is really bad, you take more sighs than other sighs. And, that's terrible. And actually, they discovered sigh, again, Dr. Beneboff. He had this big CBS TV camera because he was friends with Mr. Paley, who owned CBS, and he filmed his physiology class. And he noticed all the medical students sleeping, and then all of a sudden they take a deep breath and wake up. So he coined the word. And if you look, you remember the cartoon we showed? Well, this is it again. When you spend large sums of money and you have one of these things in your laboratory, you take pictures. This is a blood vessel. This is open alveoli. This is atelectatic alveoli. So there's not going to be a lot of gas exchange here. This is an area of cyclic opening and closing. So you kind of see the same thing as the cartoon that we saw a few moments ago. Because you want this. You want your open alveoli. Okay. So we talked about alveoli. So what keeps alveoli open in you? Pulmonary surfactant. Right? Soapiness. You remember that? Talked about soapiness. Right? But pulmonary surfactant also has another component to it. You all remember from college, high school, even medical school, 90% of surfactant is lipids. But you all forget about 10% being proteins that are broken up into the hydrophilic and hydrophobic proteins. These proteins are going to be very important in a few moments. Our laboratory moved from Rotterdam, the Netherlands, to the Charité in Berlin. This is Dr. Schroeder, one of our postdoctoral fellows. There's me wearing the university tie, looking at the experimental model. We moved from Germany, Professor Lachman's lab, and our lab moved from Holland, because in Holland, it's 65 is mandatory retirement. The Queen retired, including the Queen, and her son became the king, and she joked with her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, that she got to go to the coronation and dance at the coronation, unlike the Queen going to her grandson's coronation. Okay, so surfactant therapy for acute lung and acute respiratory distress. That, you know, if you ever want to read about that, but pulmonary surfactant was initially identified as a lipoprotein that reduces the surface tension at the air-liquid interface of the lung. You all learned about the soap bubble in physiology class, or you know, when you were learning about surfactant. And surfactant, this is an illustration. This is the lipid, and these are the proteins facing into, and they're made by the alveolar cells right here, the type 2s, you remember that. And each alveoli is very, very complex. The other thing to remember as this lecture progresses is that you have an alveolar macrophage in each one of your alveoli, and when they get atelectatic, they get very mad. And you learned about the whole soap bubble concept of keeping the lung open, the soap bubble, because of the law of Laplace, right? So the surfactant lipoproteins work under the law of Laplace. By the way, to be very, very cultured, Laplace is the name, is not a person. He was the Count de Laplace. So that is the place of his countdom, or whatever, baronship, you know. So lipids, levels of total phospholipids decrease over time. So if you have cyclic opening and closing, you're going to deplete these phospholipids. So the lung is going to be more inclined to collapse, right? So it is incumbent about you in critical care medicine to maintain a recruited open lung that is as close to normal physiology as possible. So the cyclic depletes surfactant and can lead to further collapse, because as you deplete the amount of surfactant in each alveoli, you're prone to something that we call surfactant clumping. This is the inside of an alveolus. What is this? Anybody? It has little legs and arms reaching out, hungry. Alveolar macrophage, right? So the illustration is, right? This is clumping. So we allow the alveoli to get atelectatic, then we scan the inside of the alveoli, and look what happens. You have clumping of the surfactant, which is going to make it harder to recruit this alveoli. But surfactant is also key to immunological and host defense. And you probably knew that, because the lung is the largest immune organ in your body. We're breathing in bacteria, viruses. I don't notice in Rochester, in New York State, we're all mandated to get the flu shot at the hospital, and they put a little tag, little thing on our ID card, and if you don't have that, the university police carry you out of the hospital. some of the residents have never been seen of again. So here we have these proteins, the SPD, SPA proteins, and if you look at their microstructure, you can start figuring out that these guys are there for a reason. All right? And again, all the toxic stuff that's we take in and out. And here's a nice family of proteins called collectins. Guess what they collect? Bacteria, viruses. That's what they collect. So the 10% surfactant proteins are very important because they're collecting bacteria and viruses in your lung. And here you have an illustration. Again, it's always good to have a book on physiology because the artist will draw these nice pictures for you. Because if I ever tried to draw these, I have no art. Because as you heard from Dr. Varela, he's Athenian. They painted, made vases, statues. We're Spartans. We just used an 18-inch sword and hacked people. And no, they did not wear leather Speedos and a leather and the red cape. Okay.
We have some smart ones. Like 80 miles
Yeah. So, and then they take this into the lymphatics. So these are very important things. These proteins are very important and interact with toll receptor sites. So they're very, very important in terms of removing bacteria and being part of your host defense as a unit. So if you mechanically ventilate somebody improperly and cause atelectasis, you're going to affect the patient's, and we're going to see that in a few minutes. So surfactant inactivation, so we have increased suction, high permeability. So you get this horrible cycle that occurs. So mechanical ventilation, if improperly done, increases your inflammatory mediators, causes you to become bacteremic, so the lung can make other organs sick or other organs. So this cascade of cytoactive molecules that we talk about, and you've all seen this picture from the New England Journal of Medicine that tells you how when the alveoli is sick in ARDS, how all these things are released. But if we lose this host defense due to atelectasis, it makes things worse. So let's look at how atelectasis and removing these proteins. So again, when you have a systemic inflammatory response, how many of you know that you get cell-to-cell dehiscence? You know, the big person in the ICU that's many liters fluid overloaded that looks puffy? That's because they had a capillary leak. It's more osmotically activated things in the interstitium than in the blood vessel. And some of these holes, and this is a lung alveoli, this is a lung capillary, these are RBCs being used as reference. They're about 0.7 microns in shape, almost as big to go through, and sometimes it actually gets so big that you can actually get bloody secretions with some of the things. So let's talk about a model, and this is from Jack Hatsima, one of my postdoctoral fellows in 2000. Jack is a very nice guy. He's an MD, PhD. He was my postdoc fellow for a number of years. He actually immigrated to Toronto, Canada, was on the faculty in Toronto, then went back to become chief at one of the Dutch hospitals in Amsterdam. But Jack did an ICU experiment using a rodent. He did a model of interabdominal sepsis using LPS and did lousy mechanical ventilation with lousy mechanical ventilation and PEEP. So this part of the arm was basically preventing cyclic opening and closing. And over here you could figure out that the delta P was 45, When this experiment was done in 2000, the magic delta P in the literature was 35 for mechanical ventilation. And then measured both serum and bronchial alveolar lavages. So this was the surgical ICU model. This was the patient with perforated diverticulum, right? That had no protection against cyclic opening and closing, and guess what he found? The cytokines and the bacteria were found in the lung at autopsy. So they transmigrated, they got into the lung compartment from the abdominal compartment. Then he did the pneumonia model. The patient who's admitted to the medical ICU gets pneumonia, has cyclic opening and closing, and then you find these things in the serum. So in this case, the lung compartment was violated and it got into the inter-abdominal compartment. How systemic inflammatory response can be magnified many-fold by loss of compartmentalization. That is what Jack coined, the word compartmentalization. All right? Another Dutch colleague looked at purine concentration in bronchoalveolar lavage fluid and ventilator-associated lung injury controls 7 and 0, 45 and 10, and 45 and 0. Okay? See how important this cyclic opening and closing and depletion of surfactant is in terms of protecting your body. I think this slide clearly illustrates that. And then Marco Rinieri, Dr. Rivers and I's friend, right, who's smart, did kind of a human being thing. Ventilator-induced inflammation in patients, you know, it's Europe. This is informed consent in Europe. You're consenting. That's why in all these studies they get larger groups of people. There's paternalism at its greatest effect. But this is from 1999, so this is way before ARDSNet and Dr. Amato's paper on lung recruitment, and he's looking at 36 hours in a group in a study group, and look at this, his study group, 7.6 cc's per kg. So he's getting closer to the 6.3, right? And the control is the magic 10, right? Look, 1999 magic 10. PEEP, not so much. PEEP being figured out by a pressure volume curve. PaCO2 48, mortality 38, mortality 58, ventilator 412. So massive increase in the control group of all of these things in BAL. So you're starting to see how important the effect is. And then in a follow-up study, comparing organ failure in badly ventilated people versus protected ventilation. And by protected ventilation, I mean 6 cc's per kg, pressure volume curve to maintain lung recruitment, no matter how you want to do it. You know, there are lots of ways to do lung recruitment versus conventional ventilation. So you can increase renal failure, you can increase hepatic failure. That's Lake Placid, New York, on a spring day. ARDS is a systemic inflammatory process. Right? You've all seen this picture. Type 2 alveolar, we now learned it makes the alveolar surfactant is an immunological substance, so it's very important. We don't want to deplete it when we have ARDS. We don't want to generate atelectasis. And again, here is just a photomicrograms of LVS versus control lungs. And you can see what do you see a lot of migrating into the lung. And this is from 1994. At this point in time, we didn't know about chemotactic factors that we now list many chemotactic factors. But we used to figure out that the lung, things would come into the lung in ARDS and we get hepatization. We used to use that word, hepatization of the lung, because all these red blood cells and white cells would come into the lung and it looked like liver when you looked at it. How many of you know about nosocomial pneumonia here at the Henry Ford Hospital? You have none, right? So you're lying as much as every other hospital in the United States, because if you have ventilator-associated pneumonia, your reimbursement goes down, right? I interviewed a faculty candidate from the Johns Hopkins. They're really smart people, right? They're a lot smarter than people at the University of Rochester at Henry Ford. So I said, you work in the neuro ICU. I saw in some manuscript that you guys have had 0 ventilator-associated pneumonia for the last 5 years. He goes, no, that's not true. He goes, we just renamed it so the people, it's neurogenic pneumonia. Since it's not listed, you don't get zinged, so we write down in the chart neurogenic pneumonia. You're all laughing. This is not very funny to me, because I'm part of the American Thoracic Society Committee. We're currently suing Medicare and Medicaid over ventilator-associated pneumonia, because with everybody lying and claiming they don't have any, we've lost our ability to study a disease that is physiologically based. It has nothing to do with the ventilators or the physiology of the ventilator that has to do with it. And we'd like to do studies and figure out how to really cure ventilator pneumonia versus everybody writing down crazy diagnoses. Trauma-induced pneumonia, neurogenic, it's just a... So in the Medicare and Medicaid guidelines, this is how you prevent nosocomial pneumonia. Head of bed up. Well, that could cause lung. Well, FRC can go up. Suctioning mouth care, brushing the teeth, oral intubation, special endotracheal tubes, hand washing, low gastric volumes, and humidification. What's missing? Preventing cyclic opening and closing, lung recruitment, physiologically based ventilation. Now, why are they missing? Because these things, other than the number one thing, do absolutely nothing, which would keep the number high, therefore the government won't reimburse you. I'm just kidding, but, because these are very simplistic things, but just illustrates the importance of how an ICU needs to know the better part of it, which is the physiologically based way of ventilating patients. So the presence of atelectasis leads to impairment of host defense and promotes nosocomial or ventilator-associated pneumonia. And we go back to this slide from our group. SPA and SPD binding, these are the proteins. Everybody remember the proteins when we talked about surfactant proteins? Notice what they bind. Pseudomonas, Strep A, Strep B, Haemophilus. Are these proteins protecting you from ventilator-associated pneumonia pathogens? Yes. So the less surfactant, active surfactant that you have in a mechanically ventilated lung, the less able you're able to prevent the ability to fight the common bugs that we see as the causes of ventilator-associated pneumonia. So we've talked about all the physiologically based things that do have an ability to work in taking care of sick lungs. Now, there are many things that do not work. Dr. Rivers and I are old. In the 1980s, 90s, it was anti-something cytokine was going to cure sepsis and ARDS. So, you know, the effects of inhaled nitric oxide. Notice, I took the money too. I'm from Brooklyn. We paid money. It's almost as bad as Detroit. Then I really took a lot of money because I'm one of the chief authors on this. Look at this thing. Guess what it did? Diddly squat. Okay? Because they did not control the inhaled. Now, yeah, there's this guy too, my very good friend. Huh? Look at all these characters. Right? They all took the money, but I got a lot of the money. Right? So we used all these agents, and I actually have an editorial out there that maybe these agents would have worked if we had controlled that every center used the same mode of physiologically based ventilation. Because maybe nitric oxide would work in an open lung with decreased cyclic opening and closing. Maybe these compounds would have worked. They spent billions of dollars, but in the time period of these studies, when these studies were done, there was not enough evidence to go up at people and say, no, you cannot have somebody on an SIMV at 20 cc's per kg and a PEEP of 5 when they're on ARDS and give the magic medicine. So these studies, unlike pharmaceutical studies where the control, everybody has a fib, they get the beta blocker and it goes up. Critically ill patients have a multiplicity of physiological things. So let's jump into a few ideas. You know, even SpongeBob gets, this is negative pressure ventilation. Okay? This is our surfactant depletion model followed by 4 hours. So we gave the animal ARDS or remove surfactant, open lung. ARDSNet protocol where you take PEEP off of a graph. So if you're on 60% to 80% oxygen, you get a PEEP of 12. If you're on 70% oxygen, you get 15. That's not how the human body works. Again, going back, the physicians have to understand physiology. In the open lung strategy, and these are some nice pictures from Dr. Marcel Amato's group in São Paulo, Brazil, they did a pressure volume curve, and this lung was recruited, and it was at the best part of its pressure volume curve, versus using the ARDSNet PEEP protocol. So the ARDSNet PEEP table could sometimes generate permissive atelectasis, as was quoted by Dr. Amato in the New England Journal. All right? So in other words, each patient in your ICU is an individual that needs individual care management. Protocols and guidelines work on large groups, but a smart doctor able to interpret physiological data is a wonderful thing. And again, this is permissive atelectasis. This is from our group, and this is what the lung actually looks like. It's nasty. It's upset. That's why we did a color picture here. And look what the lung looks like in permissive atelectasis with ARDS. What does that lung start looking like? What did we say in the 1960s they called it? Hepatization. And can you think that is starting to look like liver? So again, permissive atelectasis. So we want an open lung versus an atelectatic lung. So there you have a nice open lung based on volume pressure curves. And just a quick illustration from my good friend Luciano Gattinoni in Milano. Small airway collapse, usually you need a recruitment of 10 to 20. Alveolar collapse, it's a sicker lung, 40 to 60. And then if you have consolidation and permanent damage, nothing works. And you can see, this is again from Dr. Amato's paper in the New England Journal, that conventional ventilation in terms of the ability, you need less of a pressure to keep the lung open once you initially open it. So you don't need a very high plateau pressure. So PEEP is the splint, it's natural, it keeps recruited lungs open, must be titrated. And you know what the scary thing is? A lot of this information was known. The date, 1994. Rat lung. 14-0 of PEEP, 45-0. So you had a lot of cyclic opening and closing. And a few hours later, look what the lung looked like. So we've known about this, but the interpretation, sometimes as clinicians, we fall behind in terms of analyzing the data. And here you see healthy lung. And again, this is from our good friends, Dr. Steinberg and the group out of Syracuse. It talks about, and then PEEP, lung recruitment in PEEP is a lot better than nothing. And here's a very sad slide. In 2000, these are critically ill patients with ARDS. One of these snapshots, right? Snapshot by Dr. Esteban. 30% of the patients with ARDS in the world have 0 PEEP. 1 to 5 of PEEP. 6 to 10, 11 to 15, and higher than 15. You know, a lot of your ARDS patients in your ICU today are probably somewhere in this group, right? Hopefully they're not in this group. So we have made some progress in terms of people being able to understand things. And survival according to PEEP, this is Dr. Amato's colleague, Dr. Papadakos, who looked at survival according to PEEP levels and in ARDS, and sometimes the people in higher PEEP levels did better than the lower PEEP levels. Again, a very small group. These were sick people, and this is again from the New England Journal. And again, keeping the patient here in terms of the inflection point, volume versus pressure is key. And what's the important thing about Dr. Amato? Marcel Amato works in a charity hospital in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He has 20-year-old ventilators, uses expired antibiotics that he gets from public assistance in a charity hospital, and he has the lowest mortality for ARDS in the world. Because the basic thing is understanding the physiology. He understood the physiology in terms of how important the lung was as a predictor of mortality and morbidity. Small positive, results in dramatic PO and experimental of, you can just see, just titrating the PEEP by small numbers can get you a lot. And again, this is a very classic paper. Anybody in ICU should get this issue from 2000 from Marcel Amato. Again, looking at his data versus, and again now, as we talked, we have ventilators that are better able to maintain the lung open. How many, do you guys use APRV here on sick people? Because this is what it does. Because you sort of use the technology built into the ventilator to mimic physiological parameters. And, I think that's the future of what we're going to do. Dr. Barillas asked me for 5 minutes to take your time to talk to you about how many of you have seen me on national TV? Other than myself, right? I've been on Fox and Friends, 2020, CNN, ABC. Because in 2011, I noticed that my house staff was addicted to phones and staring at phones and not taking care of patients on round, right? And I have spent 30 years of my life studying ARDS, and I have pretty good, was it the factor that you get from your literature? But I wrote an editorial in one of the journals stating everybody was addicted and it was non-professional and people were not listening to lectures and not talking about patients. So, very lucky for me, or very unlucky for me, was Matt Rickle, who discovered the concept of distracted driving. His wife is a physician. She's a neurologist. And she got the journal, showed it to her husband, said, "This guy thinks just like you," and he says, "Doctors are addicted to this thing." So I was featured, and this is a picture courtesy of the New York Times. So I was the first Rochesterian to be on the front page of the New York Times since George Eastman died in the 30s. And it changed my life because the impact factor of being on the front page of the New York Times makes Fox, ABC send private jets to go fly you so you can sit on the couch on those morning shows. And I learned about something else called anti-glare, which they spray on my head. So when you're under the lights. So yeah, I got that from Diane Sawyer's people. They use anti-glare. But it is very important for you, and I write about it, and you can look about electronic distraction for professionalism, that you're not on your phone. You're not on your phone. When you're talking to patients, you have the computer screen in front of you. Patients hate that. We did surveys. We asked, when you're on the elevator and you're on the phone, and families are on there, people coming into Henry Ford, you know what they immediately think? That you're ignoring their relatives just like they ignore work at work by being on your phone. So when they see you using your phones like that, right? And I understand on rounds you all have your computers open. We only have 2 computers on rounds at my place. The attending has no computer. One for labs and data and the other one for writing orders. Nobody else is allowed to have a computer. Because actually at Northwestern, another hospital, they did a survey and they found that people were surfing the internet, looking at other people's charts, putting orders in on wrong patients. So it is incumbent on you to learn the new professionalism that you need to negotiate in this world of computers that we have in medicine, ethics, whatever else you have. You guys have ethics just like we do. And to not be taking care of the eye patient. Okay? And here's an example of the eye patient. Okay? Patient comes in, he's hit by a car, 2 broken legs. Comes into the emergency room at a major medical center, has a creatinine of 5.2. Is admitted to the intensive care unit. Okay. Because he has acute onset renal failure. Okay. 8 hours into his hospitalization, the attending walks into the room and says, "Mr. So-and-so, very prominent member of the community, do you know why you're here before your operation?" He goes, "No, I have no idea." He goes, "Well, your creatinine is 5.2. He goes, "Oh, it's down." "What disease do you have?" "Oh, I have glomerular nephritis. Type so-and-so, Dr. So-and-so has been following me. I may or may not need dialysis coming along." It's a doctor in another health system that he's seeing. go back and you do, what do they call it, root cause analysis. You get the resident, you get everybody involved. The notes are co-signed. And the problem is, it wasn't on the problem list. It also showed that everybody was caring for an eye patient. This prominent member of the society also noticed that none of the people who had written notes in his computerized chart had ever met him. So there's a big, I had to analyze this. I'm part of the board of professions of our state, looking at this problem. Obviously it was a super important person, and suddenly it became very evident that 4 physicians were taking care of the eye patient, generating very nice physicals, not knowing the reality of the patient's history. We also had a very similar episode at our place. Epic died. Some computer malfunction. And for 12 hours, no one knew the dosages of any drugs. I had to go down to the emergency room and tell the ED residents how to get a history. They did not understand the concept of speaking to people to get the history from them, because they lived in the computer, because that's their life. So that was my little soapbox now. And we're working on a textbook on electronic professionalism now that will be used in medical schools, because it actually is a big problem. Because the younger people that are coming in literally live in their reality. You understand this year alone, 27,000 people will die in the United States texting and driving? And the number keeps going up. Do you understand over 2,000 people have died playing Pokemon Go? That's not funny. But when you get that generation going into professional schools, there's a change. And the most important thing is actual talking to the patient. That's why the attending has no computer, because the attending goes in and talks to the patient. Goes in and discusses things with the care team at our institution. So there are many ways of improving professionalism that I would appreciate along, more important than trying to memorize the physiology. And like anybody who's 60 years old and has younger kids, I have to show pictures of my kids. So my kids both like dangerous sports. So there's my daughter doing hunter jumper, and my son, the reason we drove here is you can't fly with swords. You're having the national, what is it, the North America Cup in fencing, and my son fences for this country, USA. That's him, by the way. So thank you so much. Hopefully you learned a little bit about physiology. Hopefully you can project that physiology today or tomorrow or the next day on your patients and help decrease mortality and morbidity in your patient population. And I apologize for the 10-minute professionalism lecture. It's also rude if there's a speaker or somebody checking Facebook. Even